Welcome to the DFD, a podcast dedicated to all things dairy farming. Each episode, we chat with industry leaders who share insights and their experiences into the dairy business. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer, and I hope you enjoy this episode of the podcast. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the DFD podcast. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer. It's been a bit of time here since I've put a podcast out, I think June, so it's great to get back and get some information out to the listeners. And I'm super excited today. It's corn season. I know in the next couple of weeks we're going to be diving into some corn silage here, so I thought it'd be great to have Bill Mahanna back on the podcast. So Bill's the Global Nutrition Services Manager for Pioneer and also an adjunct professor at Iowa State. So good morning, Bill. How are things in Iowa today?
We're getting some rain today, Keith, so that's good news. We really need it here in the middle part of the state and the west part of the state. We're really lush in the northeast, but the rest of the state, was a welcome rain this week, about 2 inches.
Yeah, it sounds like we were just talking quick before you got on the podcast. It sounds like you've had a very similar summer to what it's been here in southwestern Ontario. It's been pretty it was really dry through June and July, and then August, it's kind of seems like we've been getting some rain. It's pretty sporadic, summer rain patterns, but corn looks, for the most part, pretty good. A lot of short corn this year.
Yeah. And
I don't know, are you seeing the same thing in that neck of the woods too? Or
yeah, where it's dry, that's what we get. Therefore, I would anticipate that the fiber digestibility is going to be pretty good on the corn silage this year, because we do know that the growing environment during the vegetative stage of the plant, if it's drier than normal, plants will be shorter, but usually the fiber digestibility is really good. So yeah. I would anticipate that the corn silage will feed pretty well this year. And being a shorter plant, if we got, had pretty good pollination and then timely rains as we get into the reproductive phase of the plant, we should have, good starch levels, and even more starch because it's, we don't have as much stover diluting it. So.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, just listening to some people talking some ear counts, and we're still looking over 200 bushel. And there's lots of places where the corn's, not 6 feet tall, or it is just at 6 feet. And there's some other stuff where the corn's a little bit taller. So I think we're in for a pretty good crop, and we need it because our hay yields have been, depending on where you are in Ontario, but for the most part, it's been pretty dry right across the thing. So our hay yields are down. So we're going to have to put some forage up for these cows for the winter. So
are you seeing a trend, Keith, even in Ontario, to higher corn silage inclusion rates in the diet? I haven't been up there for a couple of years because of both of our governments and COVID.
Yeah.
So are you seeing that trend, or is it still maybe half corn silage, half haylage or dry hay as a typical forage component?
I would say we're kind of gearing, there's a lot of herds that, we're talking 60 to 70% of dry matter coming from corn silage. Now, okay. In saying that, the protein price has been pretty high, and we came off a year last year where we had a lot of good inventory on hay. So I would say last year we were probably, a lot of places were in that 60%, 55, 60%, some even 50-50. But I would say typically we're on the higher side with corn silage, and then protein prices, they affect that a little bit. But yeah, I think in general, that's kind of where we're headed. Now you guys see the same stuff down through the Midwest, right?
Yeah. Alfalfa acres have been declining in the States for the last 25 years. And I just read something in, I think, Progressive Dairy, by one of the guys that works for a alfalfa seed company. And he had some current data, and it looks like new seedings are down again. So this last year. So yeah, I think we're seeing that trend. It's just more and more corn silage, and even to your point about protein, if we can feed a lot of really highly digestible stover and corn silage and the starch, we're driving a lot of microbial biomass. So really, we're generating a lot of our own protein needs in those high starch diets. I mean, even Cornell's done a lot of work. You'll see high corn silage diets where they're only 14.5 to 15.5% crude protein in them. So there's a lot coming from that microbial biomass if it's the right kind of corn silage.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't have to, I don't think we have to have these 17, 18% diets anymore. There's lots of stuff where I think it was 2 years ago I ran a herd at, 15% for most of the winter, making tremendous amount of milk. Now, they had some really good forage, and I think the trend here in Ontario is there's a lot more talk about some of these alternative forage and cover crops, so your triticales, your rye, your OP blends, stuff like that. So, trying to get those incorporated into the rations has been positive. The only thing is like we don't have the scale, I guess, to manage multiple faces of bunks or multiple silos open at the same time. So that's a little bit challenging, or I think maybe we'd see more. But I think corn silage would be our number one forage crop here in Ontario. And I think, yeah, hay yields are down, but I think just consistency in yield. Like we'll swing a little bit every year just depending on moisture, but in general, like there hasn't been too many areas in Ontario where we've had crop failure growing corn, and we've had lots of, I don't know if you call it crop failure with hay, but like it doesn't rain, you don't get hay.
Yep, and winter kill, you can't ever really predict that. And
yeah, we just actually, it's funny you mentioned the winter kill because we had a lot of winter kill this year. Like we were super wet last year, like right from about the middle of July into Christmas time, January. It rained quite a bit, and I think that the alfalfa didn't overwinter well in super wet soil, and we had a little bit of freeze thaw, but mostly cold for the winter. And like a lot of these third-year stands, like just decimated them. So,
yeah. To your point though about keeping multiple faces open, I get that a lot, especially the way we're trying to position brown midrib in diets today. Where to slot brown midrib into the diet where it's really going to be beneficial, and where not to use it when it's going to just simply reduce feed efficiency. And so I get that pushback a lot. But even with grasses that are high in yeast, just like high moisture corn or corn silage, that you can have heating problems. But if somebody's using a good Buchneri inoculant, I don't see why you can't have multiple faces open and not have to take off very much per day. At least that's been my experience. And that's been my experience in environments like Iowa here, where during the middle of the summer, I had a customer that, put up earlids for the first time and was concerned about it. And they used a Buchneri inoculant. And I mean, we were only taking off, about 4 inches a day off that face, and it stayed perfectly ice cold the whole summer long. So I think what I run into more is a situation where we just don't have the footprint on some of the smaller dairies to have multiple bunkers and bags laying around and that. But I think if you're using a good product, you can get away with multiple faces and not have to take off, a foot or two a day.
No, I mean, if you're running a facer, I think, and having a Buchneri inoculant, and you've got densities up into the high teens, I think you can do it. But if you're lacking, I think, on one of those, whether, if you're scraping it away with a bucket or something like that, or, maybe you didn't get it packed as well as you'd liked last fall, I think you can run into troubles there. But it's funny you mentioned the mold and yeast thing, because I think we're seeing a lot of it this year. We're seeing some depressed butter fats, and if you look at the diets, fiber's good, starch isn't overly high, things like that, and we just can't quite get our finger on it. And then so I started doing some mold and yeast testing on some high moisture corn and things like that, and seeing like crazy high numbers. Like I did a high moisture corn and it was like 50 million.
So, and they were feeding the high moisture corn during the summer, during the spring and summer.
They're feeding it right now, and it's like, I think we got to get some dry corn in here and just kind of either dilute it or take it right out. So,
and Keith, I'll be honest with you, I don't think it has anything to do with the yeast or the molds.
No.
And I think the trend that we're seeing is when we have these pretty high corn silage diets, and the guys today and gals are doing a fantastic job of kernel processing. We know that ruminal starch availability is very high. And what we have seen a lot is advocating that you can you can complement that high corn silage diet. And when I say high, I'm talking, maybe 60 pounds wet corn silage. There are obviously guys feeding a lot more than that, but let's just say at that level. We're finding that if we can be out of the high moisture corn or earlage by late February, early March, and shift into dry corn, we sail right through the heat of the summer and everything and maintain butterfat really nicely. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just that starch overload that we have from combining the highly fermentable starch in corn silage along with highly fermentable starch in high moisture corn. So guys that have had problems in the past. Now, Lehman Kung did some work looking at, yeast and what kind of effect they can have on components in that. And that really didn't really show that much. But I think we're just like what you said, that we got to get some dry corn in there. And I don't think it's dry corn is because we're getting rid of the yeast or any molds that might be going in. I think it's because we're just reducing the fermentability of the starch in the rumen. Because dry corn, if we grind it, 500-600 microns, looks like pig feed, that escapes the rumen, moves out on the liquid phase of the rumen faster than it's being digested. So we're actually just shunting that starch into the small intestines. And so we're still getting the same amount of energy in the cow, actually more, because we don't have the gaseous losses. We do have some gaseous losses in the starch digestion, not as much as fiber, but there's still some. So I think that's kind of what we've seen to be able to solve some of those butterfat depression problems we used to run into is in those diets where we just love earlage, or I call it snaplage. We just love it.
Yeah. Would that be what we call like a cob meal?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, because it's so cheap to put up, you just put a corn head on the top and on the front of the forage harvester and go to town, I mean, it's just fantastic. So it is more expensive to move to the dry corn for some of these larger dairies. But I tell you, we make up for it by just having, better rumen health and just shunting that starch now to the intestines. Now, if you don't have good kernel processing on your corn silage, that's not good because, well, we can pick that up in fecal starches. But so I think a lot of that is just looking at ruminal starch. Not that there can't be issues with mycotoxins. There certainly can be. But I think sometimes we have a tendency to want to blame a lot of things on them. And I don't know. I've been doing this for over 40 years and I've troubleshot a lot of herds. And I would say that the amount of herds that really I felt that was really a mycotoxin problem were pretty few.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I think that we're kind of cruising into a mycotoxin year here in Ontario, just with the kind of real drought stress through pollination. We've had a lot of foggy, wet, humid nights. Like when corn was pollinating, it was raining. It was perfect for that. Like we had moisture at pollination, but it was also wet for 2 weeks and kind of damp and humid and things like that. So I'm just, I'm a bit concerned in certain areas in Ontario with toxins this year.
And that's why I think where harvest timing is really important, we know that if we do a good job of, like you said before, packing a facer and a good inoculant, it's only penicillium that can survive at a pH below, say, 3.8. That's the only that's the only mold that can survive in silage, and none of the fungi can grow without air. So that's where that facer and maintaining the integrity of the pack is so important. But 99% of the toxins in a well-managed pile or bunker or tower silo or whatever were produced in the field before it ever got in the silo. And then, what I get upset by is some of these companies that say use a certain type of additive when you're making silage to help reduce that. Well, there's no additive in the world that's going to degrade those preformed toxins. So it really goes back to just a harvest timing and good silage management. And then, keeping oxygen away from the face as much as possible. They're penetrating into the face. But I know a lot of the labs, like to put out a lot of information about it. We do a lot of testing, but even the testing is really a crapshoot if you think about it.
I was going to ask you about that because, like if you do a good job of packing and getting the pH low and not allowing any air to get in there, and you're still testing for toxins, 2018, I think it was, we had a real bad jib problem. And we had corn coming off at 20 part per million, 15 part per million vomitoxin. Cows cruise through. A couple years before that, we had an issue with toxins, and I'm pretty sure it came from Dawn. And we had like 2 part per million, and we seen way more effects on cows. So it just made me think, like, how is this stuff real? What is going on here? Like, why does an 18 part per million not affect a cow, but a 2 part per million, it seems like it does?
No, those were work done in Canada showing that really high levels of DON. There are 3 different forms of DON, depending on how long it's been, the organism has been metabolizing. But, really high levels have no effect on ruminants. Monogastrics, yes, but not ruminants. Yeah. But I think the issue is the fact that, we don't know how the combination of different mycotoxins played out. We have no clue whatsoever, because nobody at the USDA or anywhere else has done work on this. I send my veterinarians to Europe to go to conferences on mycotoxins, because that's the only place I think that's really doing some legitimate work, and we kind of ignore it. Mm-hmm. Put a binding agent in it and hope for the best. And in Europe, there's been a lot of really good work, and I think products that can degrade those toxins, in the TMR mixer and that have some benefit. But we just kind of buried our head in the sand and haven't really looked at it. But to me, I think it's just what else is in there. It's just like you go back to, smut and things like that. Hopefully you guys don't have it up there yet, Keith, but we're dealing with tar spot.
Yeah, we're just starting to see it.
Yeah. And
I'm actually in the hotbed where I am. It was the first place in Ontario where it was found, on one of my friend's farms. And so now, like, OMAFRA, which is our ministry, or like State Department, is been doing some tests there. Like, it's continuous corn on corn. Like, they're trying some different things, some different fungicides and things like that here. Yeah. And we're starting to see it too.
But, that doesn't produce a toxin. But that doesn't say that the plant's under stress. There isn't something else in there, or smut, will not produce a toxin. So we say, we got smutty corn, don't worry about it. But, you just don't know what, maybe very, very small levels of multiple different toxins can have a synergistic effect and be causing problems. And that's where it gets confusing. Like what you said, 1 year we can sail through it with high levels, and next year lower levels. And we seem to have some, breeding problems and some issues. But yeah, it's really difficult to figure out.
Is there any issues with feeding smut, or is it just more of a optics thing?
Just optics, and looks bad and blows black all over the chopper. But in Mexico, it's eaten as a delicacy.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. Yeah, so, yeah. Do they have
not by you and me, but by some?
No. the locals there. Do they have any effect on fermentation? No. Okay. Yeah, it's just completely optics. What about tar spot? Like, last year was the first year that I did see it in corn down kind of at the mouth of Lake Erie, or mouth of the Detroit River, Lake Erie, down in Essex County. And like you look at the sample now and you can see it. It looks like somebody just put little polka dots on it with a Sharpie. Right. But it doesn't seem to be, there's no effect on feeding, other than the fact that I think their corn silage may be a little bit lower in energy than what it would have been. They took it off maybe 3 weeks before they should have, just because the tar spot had started killing the plant and browning up the stalk. And yeah,
exactly. And I think then the fiber digestibility starts to go. When a plant dies, then the fungi kind of take over and can grow. So yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it'd have any effective fermentation. I was just sharing emails this morning about who's going to man our Pioneer booth at World Dairy Expo, and it brought back memories of last year. All we talked about for 4 days was tar spot, because in southern Wisconsin it came in. And it will decimate. The plant will be dead in 7 days if it's high enough. And so we've even, back to the fungicide, a healthy plant, late season plant health is so critical to preventing all these issues. And I think, the fungicide, we know that, for a lot of the foliar diseases, we've been satisfied with spraying maybe at dark silk, somewhere in that right after tasseling phase. And then we've gotten enough residual to get us through the major period of time until we're going to harvest silage. But with tar spot, we're looking at a completely different approach to fungicides. It's probably going to be one there at dark silk, or when the silk starts to die off at that point in time for fungicides for leaf diseases, the general leaf diseases, northern and that sort of thing, northern leaf blight. But then the second application may be necessary depending upon what we see for tar spot. Damon Smith at the University of Wisconsin is my go-to person when it deals with looking at fungicides and how they work. In fact, I just shared some emails with him over the weekend about tar spot and some other things. So if your listeners are looking for somebody to follow or to, Damon Smith really does some really good work at University of Wisconsin.
Yeah, I know, and it's so new here, and I've been trying to sound the alarm about it because I did see it last year and what it could do. So it's just like we're already in a year where we're short on feed. Like we got to do stuff, I think, as preventative to make sure that we can get that corn crop to finish, because it like we talked about earlier, it's our most important forage. This like corn season, like first cut's pretty critical. Like I want to make sure we get a first cut at the right time to make sure that we're kind of set up the subsequent cuts after that. But I would say for our lactating herds, like this is by far, hands down, the most important time of year, is leading up into corn silage. So,
well, I'm seeing where use of fungicide on corn silage is pretty much routine today for a number of reasons. First of all, it's going to keep that plant healthier. It's going to prevent some of our leaf diseases. It's going to widen that harvest window if that plant's healthier. There's some early research we need to look at a lot more, but there may be an effect on just helping to improve not just the quality of the biomass in terms of digestibility of the stover, but maybe the quantity of it as well in a healthier plant. So there's, and that's really preliminary. Just like one trial in Michigan showed that, but we want to look at it more. That the limitation for a lot of guys is just having the equipment or the helicopters or the planes to apply it, or not having high boys to be able to apply it. But I tell you, it's kind of a routine. And I calculated out, at least what we're spending on fungicides and application. If a cow's eating 60 pounds a day, it's about 3 cents a cow a day, to have that treatment. So similar to, say, using an inoculant in terms of cents per cow per day. And it's really, really valuable. As you say, it's the most important forage crop for that lactating herd, and keeping it healthy is really important.
Like, can you prevent mycotoxins by doing fungicide?
That's some of the work that Damon Smith has done in Wisconsin. Has shown that. Yeah.
Because it makes sense that you can, just because if you're going to keep the plant healthier, you're going to have less vectors for a disease that can help, bring toxins in or get infected by a fungal or whatever.
Exactly. But, yep.
I had an interesting thought too. Like you said that with the fungicide, you can open up the harvest window. Now I had heard, I'm not sure if I had heard you on the, like Iowa, does it Iowa State has a podcast now?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did one on corn silage. Yeah.
And they were talking about actually pushing the start. Like if you have greener plant, you can actually let the milk line drop down and try and pack a little bit more starch into there. I wondered if you could kind of maybe talk about that.
Yeah, so if the plant is healthy, I think maybe some of the lower leaves are dying off, but still, if the bulk of the plant's healthy, and the ear leaf is the primary leaf on the corn plant. Most of the photosynthate is produced by the ear leaf. That's why the leafy hybrids have never really taken off, because those extra leaves above the ear really don't do a whole lot except shade the ear leaf, which we don't want to do.
Yeah.
So I think if the plant is healthy, we don't even recommend going out and doing burn downs anymore. In fact, I on social media, I don't even respond to it anymore, because I just don't have the time, or I'm losing the energy to fight the battle. I don't know, but people talking about needing a certain amount of moisture for fermentation. These are people that must not know very much about silage fermentation, because the organisms can ferment silage in a very broad moisture window, from very dry, to very wet silage. These organisms, I mean, and if you're using a purchased inoculant from a reputable company, they certainly can work in a very wide range of moisture. So, in terms of doing burn downs to look at moisture, in my opinion, it's a total waste of time. I'm going to go out and look at those healthy fields, and I'm going to break ears, and I'm going to look at the kernel milk line, and I'm going to try to target for 3/4 milk line. Mm-hmm. You go to California, they go all the way to black layer because they've got such tall, healthy plants with so much biomass, and they're a starch deficit state. So, they'll even go a little bit longer. The only thing that prevents that is custom cutters wanting to get in there early and get through all their customers. Yeah. But yeah, I think, shooting for that 3/4 milk line is the sweet spot. And, what happens in a lot of situations is it needs to be planning done, Keith, up front, sitting down with the seed salesman and the custom cutter or the guy chopping for the farm or the son doing it or whatever, is say, okay, how many acres can I plant a day? How many acres can I harvest in a day? And look at, do we need to spread maturities of our hybrids so that we can, start with a shorter season hybrid and end up with a longer season hybrid, depending on how many acres we're getting across. And that's really important to be able to try to do that. Now, if the plant is diseased, if we have, gray leaf spot, northern, if we have tar spot, anything like that, then all bets are off. I mean, Minor Institute's done some really nice work showing what happens to fiber digestibility when you start to have, including frosted corn, fungal growth that happens, and what happens to fiber digestibility. It'll go down like a rock. But if the plant's healthy, we don't lose fiber digestibility in the corn plant like we do with legumes. That mm-hmm. fiber digestibility stays pretty flat, and as long as it's flat and we're laying down starch, that's a good thing. Every day you lay where was it? I think it was, I think Joe Lauer, just summarized. Yeah, Joe Lauer, Wisconsin, just summarized some data that I saw that correspond to what we've been saying for a long time, is that a point of dry matter related to half a point of starch. So, and I think I think it can be a little higher than that. Usually we say, in a typical dry down, you'll see about a point per day drying down, but you'll see, upwards of a point, at least I've seen it many times, upwards of a 3/4 to a full point of starch laid down. So it's really starch deposition that dries down a healthy plant. It's not the fact that we're losing moisture from the stalk or the leaves. It's the starch deposition. So, when people talk about looking at moisture in the plant, I'm thinking, well, if it's going, if the moisture is going down, it's because the starch is going up. Isn't that the reason we raise corn?
Yeah.
So, don't get so focused on the moisture. Let's look at the best indicator of starch deposition, and that's kernel milk line.
Well, I know, and I kind of learned this from beef producers, because they're typically later on their corn silage than what we would be with dairy. I think we really push dairy to get into that. We're so concerned about moisture. And I think if we're feeding higher corn silage, maybe we should be more concerned about starch deposition. So like you said, like healthy plant, if it's still nice and green, it's not going to get that dry. And from what you're saying is that with the moisture, like if the moisture increases, we lose digestibility. Now, does that happen all the time, or just in certain circumstances?
Well, I mean, if we don't lose digestibility. So okay. I think across the normal harvest window from, early dent to black layer, if that plant is green and healthy, fiber digestibility hardly drops at all.
Yeah. It's when it's diseased, right?
It's when it's diseased.
Or froze.
Or frozen. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. So no, I think many of your listeners might, because we've given away a couple 100,000 of them, but the Pioneer Silage Zone Manual, we have a really nice chart in there that Dr. Fred Owens, who used to work for us, who retired probably 5-6 years ago, but did a lit search, mining our database, mining University of Wisconsin's database, and a couple laboratories shared data and looked at what was the NDFD across a wide range of dry matters. And if the plants were healthy, we tried to sort this out by, plots where there was disease problems versus healthy plants. Fiber digestibility just did not drop. I mean, yeah, if you look at the graph, and I think it contained 127,000 samples. If you look at the fiber digestibility, it dropped 2 points, and that is not significant. Unless you see a 4 to 5 point drop in fiber digestibility, that's within the error of the method. People get all excited and they look at a plot when a hybrid is, 1 or 2 points lower in fiber digestibility. It's just not meaningful. And it's certainly not meaningful from a biological standpoint when you put that into a diet with other forage sources and feeding a cow. So, really, there's no real significant decline in fiber digestibility unless the plant is diseased. So I was back in the Northeast a couple of weeks ago and talking to one of our sales reps, and it was a young lady who just does a fantastic job, and she's running all over the countryside, chopping plants and burning, putting them through a chipper shredder and putting them through a microwave. And I said, it's just a total waste of time. She goes, well, I could do a lot more determining sequencing of fields for my customers if I could just go out and do the kernel milk line. I go, that's what you need to be doing. Mm-hmm. Now, if the field looks diseased, it's dying, there's some problems, man, it's okay to take a whole plant, look at the moisture. But again, even that, I have a slide I show in a lot of my presentations of droughted corn back in 2012 when we had a heck of a drought. And it was from Colorado, and these plants were droughted and they were hailed on. There was absolutely no ear development. It looked like broomsticks standing in the field. And our research station out in LaSalle, Colorado, took some of those samples and did that. Chipper shredded them up, burned them down. One was 68% moisture, the other one was 70% moisture, because of even though the leaves were all dried up, but there's so much moisture contained in that stalk, and there was no ear development to dry it down. So this whole notion that we need to be looking at moisture. Now, then you'll hear people say, well, you got to have good compaction and you need moisture for compaction. Actually, the data from the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center, Rich Muck, shows just the opposite. You'll actually compact to a greater density with drier material. I know that doesn't make any common sense, but you actually will crush cells and pack it bigger. The problem is compaction doesn't relate to porosity. What we're trying to do in silage, we measure porosity, we measure density, but we're really, in terms of keeping oxygen out of that pit, we want to lower the porosity. So that's where moisture plays an effect, is actually filling in the air spaces so that we don't have as much porosity to oxygen penetrating into the pit. But actually creating compaction, you can compact dry material tighter, but it's more porous because of the air spaces. So bottom line is, today, the way our dairymen and beef producers have the ability to understand how to pack bunkers and piles. Obviously, we got a tower silo, gravity's doing the compaction for us, but our bunkers and piles, guys do such a great job today. And then if they're using a Buchneri inoculant on top of it, even if there was a little bit of air penetration, yeast aren't going to grow because the Buchneri will inhibit that. So I think moisture is overrated today, and we got to get beyond it.
Well, we've talked about it for how long, right? Like, it's just old habits die hard.
Exactly. Yep. Dogmas. In fact, in the PhD student orals that I sat in on last week up at Iowa State, that was one of the things that came up during his discussion with all the professors is, we all have certain dogmas that we have bought into, that that's the way we were taught, this is what our professors taught us, and that's kind of what we run with. But hopefully, there's a lot of good new work that's come out there, just like even using fungicides is almost a routine management practice today. That a dogma in the old days is you didn't spend that kind of money on a plant.
Well, it's just silage corn. Exactly. You're just going to feed it.
Exactly. Well, and especially if you get into something like brown midrib, which isn't as tolerant to drought, getting better, but still, it doesn't have quite the agronomic strength that standard corn silage does. And a product like that you're spending more for the seed up front, and it's a little more risky from an agronomic perspective, people I think have seen, yeah, wow, that makes a difference there.
With BMR, we're still going to be looking at the same thing too. Like you're going to be watching milk line more than plant moisture. Because I know the thing is always, oh, it's wetter, it's wetter, it's wetter. It just like it has to look drier before you harvest it, but it's all still, like you said, starch deposition, and it's your moisture sink.
You know, I think about it, you think about it from a haylage perspective. You and I grew up thinking that, you know, you want to get haylage cut at about 30% dry matter, 70% moisture. You know, we're going to save all the leaves. It's going to pack really well. That's beautiful haylage. And it was really producers that led us to down the path that no, that isn't such great haylage. First of all, there's plenty of moisture in there, so Clostridia have a high water demand, and we can get a lot of clostridial growth in that kind of haylage. And they taught us, you know, hey, if we get a little drier and drier and drier, today, most of the haylage that I see that I really like to have in the diet, we're talking it's, you know, 50 to 55% moisture. But yet we get it packed really well in a bunker. Okay, well, if we can pack haylage at 55% moisture in a bunker, we sure as heck can pack drier corn silage in a bunker, because we've also got that starch, which is very dense, which helps contribute to that reducing porosity.
I've seen a trend towards drier haylage. You know, kind of a 40% dry matter is kind of the minimum. It just seems to feed out nicer. Now, I'm under the impression, or I guess my antiquated thought on it is that if you have the haylage that wet, that you're trying to ferment it, first off, it's got a lot of buffers in it, so your potassiums and calciums, and it doesn't have the sugar like a grass does. So I wonder about if it's able to get good bacteria established to get the pH down compared to, because what I'm seeing is I've seen some winter forages, some triticales and things like that. Oats come off at 22% dry matter and they ferment fine, but they're also 3 times as high in sugar.
Well, if it's drier and you're low in sugars, it's going to take less sugars to stabilize the crop. So a wetter crop always takes more sugar. So if it's wetter, it ferments longer because the water is diluting the acid, so you don't lower the pH. So the drier stuff actually it's just like high moisture corn. We call high moisture corn high moisture, but it's really not high moisture. It's high moisture compared to dry corn, but it's really quite dry. And if you think about high moisture corn, that ferments just nicely, you know. I mean, and there's hardly any sugars in high moisture corn. It's almost all starches. In fact, people don't realize high moisture corn, the only place it ferments is at the very tip of the kernel. That's the only place there's adequate moisture and just a little bit of sugar to ferment it. But we don't need to drop the pH very low in high moisture corn because it's such a dry crop in general. So it really needs to just have a little bit of acid in it, and it pretty much holds it. Now, again, back to the Buchenrye, especially with what corn's worth today, if guys are putting up high moisture corn, they definitely need to put a Buchenrye on it, because high moisture corn, especially if it's been stressed at all, is just loaded with yeast. Cumberland Valley's got a really nice chart that I use that Ralph Ward gave me that shows the high levels of yeast on corn silage, high moisture corn, hardly any yeast at all on alfalfa. But there's also a lot of yeast on cereals and grasses as well. So, but yeah, drier usually ferments easier.
Yeah, and like I said earlier in the podcast, talking about that high moisture corn sample, like I don't know if I've ever seen one that high in yeast, and it's coming out of a certain colored silo. I don't want to say it, but and it's whole going in there, so it's just a tougher product to begin with, right? Like there's so much porosity, like you said before with the silage pack, like there's a ton of porosity there.
Exactly. In fact, I just looked up a paper this morning to send it to my European colleagues. We know that during the fermentation process, starch digestibility changes. So it drifts up over time. That's why we feed corn silage in the fall, new crop corn silage, say, and that corn silage starch digestibility is drifting up over time. And if we couple that with high moisture corn, that starch digestibility is drifting up over time. Back to my original point, why we kind of take the high moisture or earlage, snaplage out of the diet as we get into spring, because both of these have increased over time due to the fermentation process, and then we get starch overload. So we shift to dry corn. What made me think about that when you said that, Keith, is That's one thing. High moisture corn in a sealed unit, like a sealed store or a harvest store, where it goes in whole, that does not change over time. We did some interesting work over that. So that's a more stable feed, if you will, because the pericarp has still has integrity. So there's really very little activity of the microbial organisms during the fermentation process to solubilize. Yeah, they can't solubilize the zein proteins. That's why starch digestibility drifts up in high moisture corn and corn silage kernels, is because we're processing the kernels in corn silage and in high moisture corn. And so we splayed open these starch granules. Microbial activity is solubilizing the zein protein. The zein protein is covering all the starch granules. That's Mother Nature's way of protecting the starch from water. But the bacterial action during fermentation over time solubilize away that zein protein. Now the rumen bugs can get really rapid access to the starch granules, and that's why it drifts up over time. But in sealed units where we're putting it in whole, first of all, the fermentation is very minimal, and there's really not that access to the zein and starch granules for microbial action. So that, and I've done some work. I've tested coming out of a harvester all winter long, every couple of weeks, and then run a 7-hour ruminal starch digestion on that. It didn't change. Yeah. So actually feeding high moisture corn out of a harvester, probably you don't need to switch to dry corn, because it really hasn't increased in ruminal starch availability all that much over storage like high moisture corn would.
Yeah. But then can you run into more storage issues? Like if it's not sealed correctly, right?
Possibly, yeah. If breather bags aren't working right, if there's a lot of issues, yeah.
Yeah. And then the other thing too, like, can you get that inoculated? Like you're probably going to want to lean towards a Buckner eye too, right?
Yeah. I mean, you can mount an applicator right to blower. There's no reason you can't do that. I mean, it'll still help. It'll still help inhibit the yeasts that are there. I mean, and it'll still ferment right at the very tip, but not as much as if we grind it.
Yeah. Yeah. So the other thing I was thinking about too is like back to kind of into the corn silage realm of things. We're looking at, I think, some pretty highly digestible stuff. Should we be looking at, are we going to high chop this year, or are we going to change our chop length on the plant to try and slow that down? Like what's Bill's thoughts on a kind of drought stress crop year?
Yeah, I would never high chop a drought stress crop because, first of all, the fiber digestibility is going to be very high. And secondly, we need the tonnage.
Yeah, that's the big one.
Yeah. So we get a lot of, back to dogmas. Every year I read this stuff about you got to high chop droughted corn silage because you've got to leave the nitrates that are in the lower internodes. You've got to leave those nitrates, in the field so they're not causing a problem. It certainly is true that if we've got mama cows grazing stalks, we need to be testing those stalks for nitrates. But if we're putting it in a silo and we are fermenting that crop and we need the tonnage because of a drought and shorter plants, like you said, Keith, no, I'd chop it at absolutely as low as I possibly could, because fermentation is going to degrade the nitrates in half anyways, and that's going to be diluted again when we put it into the diet with the other forages. So, I've been doing this a long time, and I've never in a dairy cow seen nitrate issues. In fact, that was a question that I asked at the PhD orals a little bit about nitrates, and one of the veterinarians on the committee also, he's as old as I am. I go, "You ever seen a nitrate problem in dairy cows?" He goes, "Nope." So I would say the length of chop thing is interesting. The Minor Institute again is done Rick Grant has done a great job there, and I gave a talk at Western States this last year on corn silage. That's the last big talk I'm doing in my career. I'm only doing podcasts from now on.
Yeah, perfect.
I'm not going to any of these big talks anymore. I'm done with that. But I ran my presentation by Rick, because I think a lot of him and respect him. And I said, hey, this is what I'm going to talk about at Western States on corn silage. Is there anything that you would add or change? And he goes, no, I think he sent me an email a couple of days later. I think you got it. Said the only thing is the length of chop, and he shared the data that I had not seen. But they got some really good work about if we chop it longer than 22 millimeters, we are having no effect on buffering the rumen, none at all. But what we are doing is slowing down intake of cows because they'll chew to a certain particle size. So, a lot of us got carried away when shredlage came out, and some of the work that Randy Shaver showed that, you could chop out to 30 millimeters or longer, and cows were not sorting the diet or anything, but, thinking, well, it'll help stimulate cud chewing and buffer that rumen. Well, Rick's done some really good work on that, and his contention is he would not chop any longer than 22 millimeters because it's going to have really no effect on increasing the buffering in the rumen, but it's going to increase the time it takes cows to eat. And most of our dairies were overcrowded anyways, and we just certainly don't need that. So so I added that to my talk, and I've added it to everything I've done since, and training our folks at Pioneer and talking to customers, and that is that, I wouldn't go out and even the guys that have shredlage. I've talked to Roger Olson, the guy who really developed shredlage. He was one of my students when I was a professor at UW River Falls, and Roger said even the guys with shredlage are not probably chopping much longer than 26 millimeters. So, I think you probably see it too. 19 millimeters, 3/4 of an inch is kind of the sweet spot for most people. That's kind of the standard.
Well,
I think going out a little bit longer can have some a positive effect, but I don't think I'd go much below longer than 22, 24 per Rick's data.
It's funny because I had a group of producers from Quebec come down, and they specifically wanted to look at some shredlage units. And so anyways, I've got a few farms that are doing it, and their mind was blown because they were still under the impression that it should have been, 30 millimeters, and the person from the chopper company that was trying to sell them the chopper was telling them all this stuff, and we're like, guys, like, no, like most of our shredlage here, either we're doing shredlage or we're doing roll offsets, so 50% offset on each roll in the processor is what a lot of producers are doing. And like I don't usually have guys go over 20 mils, so 3/4 of an inch.
Yeah, that's a
17 to 20 I find is kind of the sweet spot. And I think a lot of it depends on how well it's getting processed too.
Exactly. And a lot of guys are running shredlage rolls just because they're super rolls, and there's a lot of other bells and whistles that come with it, like, oilers on the bearings and other things like that I don't pay much attention to. But guys will run those just because, they just do such a great job of processing. And, now Kloss owns the patent to shredlage, but there's a lot of other knockoff units out there that, and the secret to shredlage, I think, wasn't so much the double cut roll, the Lauren rolls, but I think that may have had some effect, but I think more of the effect was right out of the gate, they had a 50% differential on them because it was built a lot stronger. And today, almost all the, if you get from Horning or Shearer or anybody, they've got rolls that they've designed that will have that 50% differential, which is really good. One of the interesting, had a conversation the other day about down the Panhandle, people looking at forage sorghum, because they're just running out of water down there. But one of the issues is, can forage sorghum displace corn silage in some of these really water deficit areas? One of the real issues is the fact that the rolls today have a hard time crushing those berries. So theoretically, on paper, you may look at the starch content in forage sorghum and look at the biomass yield and say, hey, that looks pretty good. But when you put that into a diet, recognizing that it's pretty darn hard to get those berries crushed, and they tend to go right through, and the fecal starches therefore are high, there's still a little bit of a limitation with that. But that's just something that's kind of popped up on my radar in places like the Panhandle that are really struggling. And then you look at roller mills that have to have more teeth per inch and that sort of thing in those markets. In fact, I had them on my list of things to do here is to get a hold of Roger Olson, and because I know that Shredlage was looking at some rolls to specifically design for sorghum, and I don't know really where they are now.
Like, they're doing the sorghum as a grain starch crop then? Like, they're not
harvesting the whole thing, as silage, corn, as forage. Yeah.
And then you kind of briefly talked about nitrates. So from what I gathered, like, we don't really have to worry about them in a dairy situation. Like, I know it's a question we get every year. Every year, I think it's the same answer. Is like, we don't got to worry about it unless, like, even with, like, if you say it's drought stressed all summer, you get 2 inches of rain right before you're going to chop. Like, it's probably not going to mobilize that much up into the plant, is it?
No, but and I don't think. Again, the fermentation process will degrade it in half. So if you're 40,000 or 4,000 parts per million after it's fermented, it's going to be 2,000 parts per million. And then you're going to, dilution is a solution. It's going to be diluted in the diet, and you're going to get it down. And even Dr. Fred Owens, who used to work for us, who was a professor emeritus from Oklahoma State, first paper I ever heard Fred give was at dairy science meetings, and he gave very interesting paper on nitrates in beef cattle. And even if you adapt them to it somewhat slowly, the rumen has the ability to adapt to high levels. So, and hopefully we're not running out of old crop and going right into new crop anyways. Hopefully we're a little bit of a transition period. So yeah, I don't think it's, people can test it, send it in. Doesn't cost very much to get it tested. It's $10 or something. I mean, it doesn't hurt to have it tested, but I did see, Keith, something on social media the other day. It was a bag of corn silage, and it was just completely orange, all in the front of the bag and all on the grass in front of it. And that's the nitrous oxide. Yeah. So that was gassing off. So I saved that picture, and I'll put it in my PowerPoints because it shows it. Yeah, that's now. The problem is that the gas can kill you. So it's being reduced, but it's getting into a noxious form. So if guys are feeding out of tower silos in a feed room, you got to be dang careful because that stuff is heavier in there and it'll come down the chute. And I saw something the other day. Some company was building tower silos, and they talked about having a separate ladder at the top so somebody could get in and level it off. And I thought, oh God, it reminded me of being a kid. But I thought, man, you want to be careful if it's droughted corn silage, go walking in there and leveling off the top of a tower silo, because that gas can really get you. And you'll even see that in bunkers or piles. You'll see a dead pigeon or a dead mouse or something down at the bottom when they're trying to get some grain, because that gas is heavier than air, and it can be a problem even there for cats or dogs, that kind of a thing. But I don't think it's a feeding problem, unless if you're going to graze stalks, then it's an issue.
Yeah, because then, there's no dilution to that, right?
Yep, and no fermentation process that happens.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
And then the last thing I kind of wanted, like, we've covered, chopping, packing, all that other stuff. Now I want to kind of covering. It's one of those things, like, if you're talking about reducing porosity in the pile, I've seen enough walls that are pitted. So, like, producers, should they be doing like a vapor barrier all the way around or just on top? Should they be doing sidewall plastic? Like, even just like top cover plastic on the sidewalls to keep kind of moisture and kind of seal that up. Like, what are your thoughts on that stuff?
Yeah, in fact, in our Pioneer Silage Zone manual, I have a picture of a high moisture corn pit here in Iowa, that series of pictures how to do it, and I label it making a bag out of a bunker. And I think it's just, it makes a lot of sense, even if it's not pitted. Put normal plastic down the walls. Well, actually, so that we don't rip the plastic, we actually put drainage tile on the top of the wall, so that when we put the plastic over it, we're not ripping the plastic. Put plastic down the wall, stabilize it with a little bit of feed just to hold it, and then it goes over the sides, fill it, use oxygen barrier to film just on the top, and then lap that plastic over and fill it. So, and it just makes perfect feed. And the other thing is, in environments like where you and I live, if we have any snow or rain that melts, it's going to go down between the wall and the plastic. And if we've got the right slope to the pit, it's going to come out. It's never going to touch the feed. And so, you always see, a little bit lower compaction density next to the wall because people are afraid to get the tractor tire right next to there and compress it the way we'd like to have it. And then you get water running in there. And water running in there, if you get snow or melt off and it comes off the plastic and down, and it gets into the silage, it'll wash away the lactic acid. In fact, listeriosis, circling disease that we have always thought about, you only see it in sheep. Well, I finally had my first case about 6 or 7 years ago. A really well-managed small feed yard here in central Iowa was having about 5 or 6 steers every day start circling and then die. So the daughter of the farmer is actually a veterinarian. So she did some testing thinking it was probably listeriosis, and it was. And I went there and we isolated. They had a bunker built into a hillside, and the water was running down the hill, and they didn't have any plastic down the walls, the earthen walls or anything. Water was running down the way it was sloped, running into that silage and just washing all the acid out. Well, the listeria then was growing. And then if, a cow gets gets any kind of injury in her mouth or anything like that, that listeria gets in the bloodstream and that goes to the brain. And that's a big problem. So we actually saw that's where the listeria was growing, is where there was no lactic acid, where the water was washed out. So that's another reason, make a bag out of a bunker. And it just is now guys say, well, yeah, it's a pain in the butt to do. I'm going to rip that plastic when I'm packing and filling that bunker. Yeah, you're going to rip it every once in a while, but in the general, you're going to have most of it's going to be protected very well. And then I'm not a big believer of tire to tire either. It's just not required. It's a pain in the butt. It's, I like to use pea gravel bags or tires, but I put them in strips. You don't really need tire to tire to tire to tire. Especially if you're using oxygen barrier film. The tires are not creating any kind of compaction. The tires are just there to hold the plastic down.
Yeah.
So if you have a strip, depending how much you're taking off, how much plastic you're cutting off at a time, that's about where I have my strips, rather than having to have tire to tire. And the most important thing is, even if you don't like to use pea gravel bags, at least buy enough pea gravel bags to put on the very face of the pile, a drive over pile or bunker, so that we don't get air billowing underneath the front of the plastic. Even when you've got tire to tire, those pea gravel bags just work a lot better to be able to seal that front edge of the plastic. And that's why I like, for oxygen barrier film, I like the 2-step approach. I like to put the film down and then normal 6 mil ag plastic. There are companies, and I know it's a lot easier. There are companies, I know there's a company here in Iowa, Raven Industries, that makes a product where the oxygen barrier film is embedded into the plastic, and it's got a cord woven through the plastic. It's very tough, and it's a lot easier, and it's a good product. But I still kind of like the 2-step approach, because if then any air does get underneath that top layer of plastic, at least it's not billowing down into it because of the oxygen barrier film.
Yeah, and you see a lot of producers they'll put dirt like on the front, like on the leading edge of the plastic. They'll just take buckets of dirt and dump it there.
Yep, that works. Yep, to seal that
Yeah.
initially. Yep, that works very well.
And then I guess the last thing I want to talk about is safety. The fall, like I know everybody says, "Oh, the spring's real busy." I think the fall is busier. I think we start now, doing fourth cut hay, and then it turns into silage, and then we're doing high moisture corn or earlage, and then we're soybeans, and we're doing manure and working ground. Like it doesn't seem like it stops till November, December. So I just I really just like, we've had some farm accidents here in the last little bit in Ontario, and it's just sad to hear. And I think it's really tough for families and things like that. And everybody's pushed to the edge now. And I don't know what it's like in the US, but like we have a huge labor shortage. And so everybody's just trying to do more and more and more, and people
Yeah.
get tired and dehydrated and they're not eating right. And yeah, it's just sad to read about it on social media every day or every couple days.
Yeah. And interesting you bring that up because, I agree. And I got thinking about when you move that plastic, that big bunker, 30 feet in the air, and you got somebody up there cutting plastic back, and that stuff can cave down and they can fall. There's the same kind of harnesses that are used when guys are doing roofing work. I'm seeing a lot of dairies are having their employees wear that harness that's tethered to the back just with a simple stake. And then, and I know a dairy in Wisconsin, Alpha Lawn, that had saved 2 people from falling off the face of a very large drive-over pile because it caught them, or they would have, they would have landed. And I think of all the great work that Keith Bolson, rest in peace, did to make us sensitive to, silage.
Yeah, he was amazing for silage safety, because he was the advocate for it. He was the real person pushing to make sure everybody got home at the end of the day.
People don't. I think a lot of younger people in this industry know Keith Bolson from his great safety work, but I don't know if they realize what great silage work he did in terms of we know. I mean, and especially if you're from the East, you may not know of Keith. The only reason I know of Keith is because about half the people that I work with in silage here at Pioneer are K-Staters. And they all
he's at Kansas State, right?
Yeah. And they all had Keith as a professor. In fact, the guy who hired me to Pioneer, Dr. Steve Soderlund, is one of Keith's students. And, I thought I knew everything about silage coming from New York and then Wisconsin. But when I got to Iowa and I ran into all these K-Staters, I realized, wow. I mean, the work that Keith did, just phenomenal work in terms of, what the feeding value is on, the top 3 feet of silage. Most of the spoilage is going to happen in the top 3 feet. And that's back to the beef guys. Keith, we got to do a job to convince those guys to do a little bit better job. They don't realize the losses that they're incurring. I mean, there's some guys that do a fantastic job, but I think there's more beef guys than there are dairy guys that need to be educated in what those losses can be. That's one thing. Can I just take a second to talk about dry matter loss? Because this is a big point. We use the term shrink in the industry. What's the shrink of your pit? But if you look at dry matter loss, I ask a lot of big dairies, what do you think the loss is in that pile over there? And they'll say, well, I'd say maybe 6 to 7%. And here's why they say that. It's certainly more than that, but here's why they say that. They weigh everything in. Everything comes across the scale. They know the tonnage that went in. They weigh everything out. Goes into their TMR mixer. They've got a feed tracker. They're weighing it all out. They're looking at those 2 numbers and saying the difference in that is dry matter loss, is shrink. It's not. Because during the fermentation process, when sugars are oxidized, 60% of the weight, 60% of the mass remains as water. Mm-hmm. Silage always comes out of a pit, a silo, a bag, anything. Silage always comes out wetter than it went in. And the worse the fermentation, the wetter it comes out. Mm-hmm. Because you're using more sugars to fuel that fermentation, and you get more water produced. So dry matter loss, you can, and I have a chart in our silage zone manual, some work that was done at the University of Wisconsin that shows, if somebody thinks they have a shrink loss of 7 or 8%, the actual dry matter loss is closer to 15%.
Oh, really?
So, yeah. So it's really, really important that we, do a good job. You started off perfect. Pack it right, use a good product, pack it right, and use a facer. Those are the 3 key things. And then we talked about covering. But the people are diluting themselves a little bit, and then the other thing about dry matter loss is what you lose is only the goodies. I was
going to bring that up. Yeah.
And so you got to value shrink loss. I still use the term shrink. I got to stop that. I'm too much of a farm boy. To replace the dry matter loss in silages, you have to replace it with an equal energy source that you lost, and that means corn grain.
You can't put a dollar value on corn silage on it because we got to put the goodies back in there. We need the energy. We need we need the sugars and starches and that kind of stuff.
So you got the dry matter loss has to be replaced by cornmeal.
Mm-hmm.
At whatever that's selling for.
That's where it gets really costly because we just talked about it last week in a webinar. We're looking at ground corn at 370 Canadian for a metric ton. Wow. So it's costly enough. So
wow. Yeah. That's where investment in a research proven inoculant, investment in oxygen barrier film, investment in a facer, investment in plastic down the sides. That's where all that pays off because what you had to replace it with is really expensive today.
Yeah. And your inventory, you're just going to have less inventory. You're going to run out a month before you kind of anticipated it. So it's one of those things that I'm an advocate about. I guess I should stop using the word shrink too and start talking about dry matter loss. But I guess we could talk about shrink when it comes to ingredients and stuff we're bringing on the farm too, right?
Oh yeah. I'm trying to make that distinction between what we think of as shrink and what is really true dry matter loss. And I've forgotten most of the chemistry and biochemistry I learned, to be honest with you, Keith. But I do know that 60% of that mass remains as water when you oxidize sugars, and that's what we're weighing out. We're weighing out water. We're diluting ourselves that we're weighing out silage.
Yeah. And I know it's a tough one to measure, but so everybody has these ideas. Oh, I don't have that much. Well, I think if you look at the work that the universities have done on it and kind of look at what's going on the farm, it's very costly. And I know land is expensive, fertilizer is expensive, seeds expensive, herbicide, fungicide. There's a ton of costs that line up with the cost production on corn.
Did you really have to bring up that seed was expensive? Did you have to bring that up?
Well, I have to blame somebody for something because it's always feed price. It's always feed price or feed cost.
Yeah, I'm blaming you guys. Blaming you guys. Don't get a cheap shot in this podcast here, man.
Yeah. But I think I've got a farm going through the exercise of doing, they're looking at feeding their neighbor. So they're going to go through and do a real cost production on what it costs them to produce forage. And when you start adding it up, it's a lot. And then the other thing is expensive about feeding cows is running a mixer or a truck or a tractor and a tub or a self-propelled. There's a real cost to that too. So it's just kind of funny. You don't think about it because we're not doing it I'm not giving Bill $5 during this exchange, but all this money exchange happened all the way through the year, and it really just it's funny how much it adds up, and then it really puts an impact or brings into perspective, I guess, what the cost of dry matter loss is. Because
I had a nutritionist. We always and where you and I are from, the Northeast, and that forages are still probably the cheapest diet. Higher forage inclusion rate usually makes sense. But I had a nutritionist tell me one time that, Bill, that's not the case in every portion of the United States. He goes, forages are very expensive. They're very expensive for our large dairies to truck long distances. He said, that's why we're feeding a lot more, co-products, commodity feeds. Yeah. Because they're just a lot cheaper than forages. So if we in California, if we can buy almond hulls, right? We have that in the diet as much as we can because that's going to displace some forage that are very, very expensive. So yeah, you're right. I think I try to look up the budgets. Iowa State has a nice ag econ department has nice budgets on producing corn silage and corn grain and that. I try to look those up to remind myself exactly, how much is invested in it. It's well, to give you an idea, down the panhandle of Texas right now, wet corn silage out of the field before, not including the harvest cost, is $110 a ton.
That's as fed, right?
That's as fed.
That's wet feed. Yeah.
And that's before harvest. That's standing in the field.
And that's US dollar and short ton.
Yes.
So if I converted that to Canadian, we're probably looking at $150.
Yep. I was in Washington State. They're over $80 a ton. So yeah, you start to figure the yields. And
well, the other thing too, like I know seeing it this year when second and third cut weren't very good, it's costing, so a producer has to pay to have a custom chopper come in. It's probably $1,500 an hour to have them on the farm by time. If they got to pay for cut, pack, merge, chop and haul, it really adds up.
Right.
And when you're getting a half a ton or a quarter a ton of dry matter per acre, it really makes that feed expensive.
Exactly.
So
yeah, I hear you.
Was there any other kind of final thoughts that you had with what producers can do here this fall to make sure that their silage harvest is safe and successful?
I just think, they got to get out and look at the corn. They got to get out, you and I as nutritionists, we know we have to walk the strings to know what's going on. They have to get out in the field, or else, whoever they have charged at their operation to be focused on the agronomy side of it, they got to walk fields, see what's going on. Today, most companies will fly drones. We can tell where problems are.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they got to understand what is the status of the crop, and look at harvest timing like we talked about. The other thing I'm a big believer is that I said that I think fiber digestibility is going to be higher in this in any corn that had a dry early part of the growing season. But I think at least in the models that I use to balance and troubleshoot diets, I have to know the rates of digestion. And I'm just not convinced that when we send a sample into the lab that we are using the regression equations that either Dave Mertens or Mike Van Amberg or anybody developed that's truly giving us the rate of digestion. Mm-hmm. Because I see when we measure it in laboratory methods like fermentrics and things like that, they just differ so much. Which one do I use? I mean, they don't come any smarter than Mike Van Amberg or Dave Mertens, but I have a measured value that agrees with neither one of them, and they don't agree with each other. So what do I put into the model to balance these diets? So I think analysis, to me today, where we're lacking is we can grow the crop and we can harvest it at the right time, but do we know how to feed it? Mm-hmm. and especially on our big dairies, can we wait 2 months to figure out how to feed this stuff? Well, we've lost a lot of income in 2 months on these dairies. So I'm a big believer in more sophisticated analysis, so that I know what not with the 30-hour NDFD models don't use that number anyways. I need to know what the rate of digestion is.
Yeah.
And I'm a big believer, and now, we can send samples to, Rock River, Dairyland Labs, Cumberland Valley. We can send samples to any lab here in the United States and get fermentrics results. So I'm a big believer in having those rates, because again, I've struggled too much getting the diet dialed in, and we can't afford that anymore. So I think that's our Achilles heel today, is really knowing how this stuff feeds.
Yeah, it takes some time to get, like, as somebody that's doing nutrition, takes some time. Like, you got to try it. Okay, this is our response. Let's do a tweak here, a tweak there, but then you got to wait 2 weeks, and it's yeah. I guess it's all about input information. If we're going to input better information into these models, we're going to get a better result. And the labs do a wonderful job, but we're still learning every day too, right? So,
Exactly. Yeah. All right, Keith. Well, hey, good to spend some time with you again.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast again, Bill. We had some real good response last year, and I thought it was kind of a no-brainer to get you back out in front of people. I know, like you mentioned before, you aren't going to do any big talks anymore, but it's we do really appreciate you having some time cut out to come on the podcast.
Yeah, I've got 2 new young. I just hired about 4 years ago. I hired a veterinarian, Adam Kroll, he was on staff at Iowa State and has a lot of practical experience. And then in January, I hired a guy named Nelson Lobos, who has a PhD under Glenn Broderick at the U.S. Dairy Forage Research Center. So I've got 2 young guys on the team there. They're a lot smarter than I am, Keith. I'm kind of phasing out a little bit.
You're a good mentor.
But my golf game is getting better, Keith.
Oh, that's good. That's all. That's really what's important. So, okay.
All right.
Thanks again, Bill. We'll touch base. Thanks again. Bye.
Yeah. Good talking to you, Keith. Take care. Bye.
Thanks for listening. This episode of the podcast is brought to you by the dairy team at Trout Nutrition Canada and our SureGain dealer partners. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe or follow us on your favorite podcast player, and please leave us a review. If you would like more information about today's discussions, please reach out. We have left our contact information in the show notes. I would also like to extend a special thanks to our sound engineer, Daniel Noguera.